All right, welcome to our next session. And we're so glad that you're here. This is going to be, this might be one of our most important sessions that we have for our PILA conference. And the title of this one is called The Masks of Racism. And I'm joined here by three amazing men of God. We have Philip Bonaparte II. He's the youth director in New Jersey for the Church of God. And we have Brian Lee, and he is the youth director in the great state of New York. And then we have Max Reyes, and he is the youth director in Michigan. And so we're so glad to be joined here by these three guys. And we're going to tackle a very tough issue, it's a hot topic right now. In fact, unless you've been living under a rock, you know this already. And so I've asked these three men to join me as we do kind of a roundtable discussion on this topic. We're just going to talk about racism and prejudice. And our main idea here in the next little bit is how do we help educate our students on the effects of racism and train them to combat it in a way that brings honor to God and marginalized groups. We hope to put some tools in your hands and to open up this discussion that maybe you can carry into your student ministry. Those of you that are listening, you may work with teenagers, or you may be a children's minister. This is a topic that needs to be discussed even in children's ministry. Now, obviously, you would talk about it differently with children than you would with youth, and you talk about it differently with youth than you would with adults. And so knowing your audience is so important. But I've asked these gentlemen, and we'll start off with Phil on this one. Have you experienced, would you be comfortable in sharing any experience that you may have had with racism in the church? It doesn't necessarily mean in the Church of God, but maybe in a church or with someone that is connected with a church.
Yeah, sure. In church, it happens not as blatantly as you may see in the secular world, but it definitely does happen. An example of this that I can utilize was a few years ago when I was at Lee University. I was traveling in a music group, and we went to a church, and it was actually one of the first churches we went to. And here I am, a 17-year-old kid from New Jersey, singing and doing my thing. And then after the service, a gentleman came up to me and was like, "Man, I was just really surprised to see someone like you up there singing those types of songs." And me being me, I was like, "Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it." And for other people on the outside looking in, they might not look at it as a big deal. But it was very clear what he was trying to say, which is, you're a black man in the South singing Southern gospel music. We are in complete shock that you are, one, even knowing what it is, and two, capable of doing so. And those little things happen a lot in ministry. And again, I don't think it's anyone's fault, but I do recognize that it takes place, and it's just due to the lack of knowledge that many people have. And it's just the underlying stigma of race in ministry, because we're looking at race first as opposed to looking at Christ first. So that's my story, that and I'm sure others can attest to it. But if I can give one small word of advice with that, is just for us as believers, we are always Christians first. And we have to recognize that as the first component whenever meeting someone. Either A, they are already a brother and sister in Christ, or B, they are just a lost brother and sister in Christ. Mm-hmm. Looking at things from that way will definitely help us in our ministries in the future.
Max, what about you?
I agree with Phil. I don't think racism in the church, or prejudice in the church, is ever going to be overt. It's never going to be just out in the open like that. It's always going to be covert. It's going to be subtle. It's going to be many times things that we don't even know is happening within us, or we're saying, and can be taken in that manner. For me, I think growing up, grew up in the inner city, was raised there in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which most people would think it's Amish town, but right in the middle, there's a small city where you had so many people just coming in from, I'm originally from New Jersey, but you had a lot of people coming in from New Jersey, different areas, New York, and there, so lived in the city there, and was raised Church of God, Spanish church, but connected with different churches, Kojic churches, and with churches in the suburbs. Just really just built a lot of relationships. And one of the things that I seen just growing up, and then just even now as we've been able to just connect with different churches, is many times how churches in the suburbs can come into the city, and it's doing outreach ministry, and it's wanting to connect with the city churches, but many times coming in, and again, this is some of the things that I've personally experienced even being young, and then you look back on it like, wow, is almost coming in as if, hey, we're going to help a people that's less than us. And when we look at what racism is, it's looking at a subgroup of a race or a people as less than and superior. Now, again, I don't think that they came in with that mindset, but almost as coming in and out, or we're going to help you, and looking, the feeling coming in felt more as I'm not a person, I'm a project. I think that can many times be the experience that many people feel. And again, it's not that they're doing it overtly or intentionally, but the way that it can be lived out, because it's almost a in and out, or I'm here to save you from the area that you're in. So that's some of the stuff that I've experienced there. And I think as an adult in leadership, that the Lord has given me the opportunity to serve in many different contexts. My heart, burden, and passion is to be a bridge to culture and generation. That's what drives me. I think that you begin to really see, as the Lord is placing me in some different areas. One of the big ones that I still get to today as I enter into different areas for the first time is man, you would do great with our Hispanic community. You would, or right away that is brought up. And again, I get it. It's the context. I know I can reach it, but many times that can be received. And again, I've had experiences to not look at it in that way, and I thank God for it, but it could easily be received as I'm only good enough to receive to minister to Hispanics because I'm Hispanic, in that sense. So those are probably some of the things there that I've experienced, and I think many people probably experience within those contexts that were similar to mine. So,
do you find that you have to? Do you find that you that you have more success when you immediately tackle that issue when it's brought to you, or do you just kind of squelch it and pray that you'll have an opportunity to speak to that person at another time? Like, how many times do you have to be silent?
I think I'm not going to sit there and just say as soon as it happens, hey, I'm going to confront it in the moment. It's almost like Phil. Many times you just kind of shrug it off. I think for me, it's been in close proximity and relationships that a lot of that has been able to have those conversations, and then just pray that, hey, I'm leaving, in many contexts, I'm leaving there, but I have the opportunity to build bridges and relationships with people who are continuing to serve in that context. And a lot of times my prayer is, Lord, allow me to build some solid relationships in the context that I'm in. And hopefully that can begin to trickle down through leadership and down into then the local area. Because again, a lot of times when you're going into these contexts where they've never been exposed to anything outside of what they know, you'd be doing it all the time. But again, I think that when we're able to connect, do things like this, where we're impacting youth leaders and their point of view, now they're able to go back into local settings and begin to make that impact from a local level there. So
that's good. Brian, how about you?
It's almost kind of like on the other side. Just like Phil and Max shared, it's not that racism is anybody's fault. It's a systematic thing that comes from this system that's been ingrained within our country, within our society. And so it's kind of, there's two kinds of racism, like they said. There's active racism and there's passive racism. And as somebody who's experienced life in a lot of different immigrant churches, I feel like that passive racism has always been a factor, because people tend to congregate toward their people groups. People tend to congregate toward their racial groups. And that's something that I experienced a lot as a kid. Growing up, my parents brought me to a Korean-speaking church. It's an immigrant church meant for immigrant community, which is a noble thing to have in the beginning. But what happens is, along the way, it becomes not inclusive toward people that can't speak that language. And so I've seen a lot of conflicts birth out of that particular issue at hand, where the church itself is culturally one language, and so they cannot communicate, or they can't interface with a big part of the community that is English speaking. I've seen issues kind of derive from that happen between two different congregations, because a lot of times in the city and in New Jersey, there's a lot of churches that share buildings. I don't know if this is common in the South, but in New Jersey and in the city, because of the lack of space, and it's hard to find a church building or build a church building, it's very expensive. What happens is there's a lot of congregations that tend to use the same building at different time slots. And so I remember as a kid, we had to have service done in 2 hours, because right after us, the Spanish service is coming in. And after the Spanish service comes in, then the white congregation comes in. And so because we're in the same spot, we're not worshiping together, but we are coexisting in the same space. And because we're all from different cultures, I've seen a lot of clashes where cultures didn't really mesh well. And so that's part, I think, that kind of shows how racism has really deeply ingrained a lot of us, is that it's not something that happens on purpose. It's not something that happens intentionally, but unintentionally, because of the way that we gravitate toward particular racial groups. That's always kind of been there for me. So I've had to navigate that a lot. I've been a youth pastor at a Korean church with a full Korean congregation, at a Caucasian church with a full Caucasian youth group, at a Jamaican church with a full Jamaican youth group, with a Korean American pastor. And there's a lot of different things that you experience once your cultures don't really align.
That's good. Those are all great points. From my perspective, which each of us shares a different perspective, and I think that's what makes this conversation so good and so healthy. Growing up in the Deep South, it was nothing for, I remember youth pastoring at a church, and we began to have a bus ministry, and busing kids in from, and our target area was mostly lower income. And so that would bring a particular flavor of children to our church that normally wouldn't come into the church. And so I remember having a discussion with one of the elders of the church, and in describing what was happening, they were using terms like, we're not really sure if we want those kids mixing with our kids. And I just thought, and even then, in in my lack of education, I thought, wow, like it's an us and them thing, you know? And so I ended up pulling that church elder aside, and I said, you know, respectfully, this is not tooting my own horn because I messed up a lot and I've made a lot of mistakes in life, but I just pulled him aside and said, listen, from this point on, they're our kids, all of them. They belong to us. If they're in this community, they're our kids because that's what we're called to be. And, you know, so I think that sometimes we can lean towards that as well. And that can be done across, doesn't matter what kind of church you go to. If you begin to bring people that don't look like you, don't smell like you, don't act like you, then it can become an us and them type of a thing. And so thank you guys for sharing that. I know sometimes when we share things like that, it's like opening wounds. And but I think that we're better when we can share our experiences. Why is it important to have conversations about race and racial reconciliation with our students? Why is that important? And Brian, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's important because that's something they experience on a daily basis. It's one of those topics that can be very sensitive, but if they aren't handled and they're not addressed in a proper and loving way, it can manifest in just them taking things to another level, you know, with their friend groups. Because if you look at the population of America and you see the school groups that they belong to, there's a lot of diversity there. And I know when I was a child, I was one of the only Asians in my school, and it was there were parts of it that you know, I had a great childhood, but at the same time, I had a very sordid middle school years because of a lot of misunderstandings that happen between kids. And it's not because these kids come and, you know, they're just trying to be aggressive. It's just that because they encounter somebody different someone that has a different culture than them, because they don't understand it, their outlets of expressing their confusion can escalate to almost physical altercations at times. And so I think in order for our students to be in more harmony with the people that are around them, to be in more harmony with the different culture groups, different ethnic groups, those conversations need to be had, especially by those that they consider to be authorities in their lives, such as ministers or the parents or people that they trust, because those are the people that will be able to answer the questions that they're almost afraid to ask, right? Because it's almost so there's such a stigma attached to talking about race. It's like one of those things that you don't talk about, like religion or politics, right? And we have to show them that it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to learn and to obtain a new perspective, to be able to really coexist, you know, with one another. And so those conversations might be difficult to have, but I think there's a lot of value in pointing them toward the right way, especially in how to handle their confusion once they come across it, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is so difficult? I mean, I know, but just I'd like to hear your perspective. Why is it so difficult to tackle this issue? Why are we so afraid to talk about it?
It's because it's one of those things that I think people don't like to acknowledge that they're racist, or they don't like to acknowledge that they have a problem with racism. And because of that, you know, they kind of grow up thinking, oh, I'm not racist. Like, racism doesn't really exist within me. But there's a lot of things that, because of the particular communities that you grow up in, and even as a non-Black person of color like myself, you know, there's a lot of things that I had to deal with in my perspective on other races as well. Because of the way that my parents live, because of the way that our communities live, because the way that racism is almost systemized here in this country. And I don't like to say things in such broad strokes, but I think it's something that we have to acknowledge that it does exist. And because it does exist, we have to talk about it. And if we don't talk about it, it's something that when they encounter, these students won't be able to approach it in a healthy way, because they'll be kind of only tackling it from their perspective rather than being able to take another person's perspective into account. So for me, for instance, growing up, my parents, and I don't think it's just my parents or just the Asian community, but there was something along the lines where it was popular for certain minorities to kind of try to be closer to Caucasian people or to white people because they were looked as, this is the way that you succeed. This is the way that, you know, you don't start any incidents. This is the way to live peacefully, right? And so there was a sort of like inherent, like, oh, you have to be closer toward white people than other groups because those are the people that consist that make up the majority of this country. And so even though they might not have been doing it intentionally, there was kind of there's kind of like that kind of stigma, right? That even my parents placed within me. So as I was growing up, you know, my parents wanted to bring me to places that had more white people because they thought it was a little more like the education the level was a little higher, or things along those lines, because the way that things were distributed during that time. And so because of that, it's almost like as I was growing up, I had to kind of be a model minority, right? And they kind of throw that word around. And so Asians are almost considered to be like a model minority. But I think that's a really terrible mindset to have, because if there's a model minority, right, there's a troublemaking minority as well. And so, and I think that's something that we have to break. And these are certain things that I struggle with personally. And I'm speaking from my personal experience. Even as a person of color, you know, it's easy to see, or it was hard for me to see, but it's easy to see now that there are inherent racist and stereotyping components to who made up who I was because of my culture, because of my society, because of my community, and because of my ethnic group. And so I think because of those things, it's so important to address those things with the student body, with young people, because it'll help them start discovering that at an earlier age, and it'll be easier for them to have that conversation and to have, you know, to take action so that they don't have those conflicts as they get older. If, you know, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Max, how might a student pastor, whether that's a youth pastor or a children's pastor, how might they, and I think this was your question that you had actually messaged us, how might they take up the cross on anti-racism in their community? What are some things that they can do to help alleviate the issue and the plague of racism?
And I want to and we'll go into that. If you mind me, I just want to piggyback just off of that, Absolutely. Just the important, our role in reconciliation. And I think it leads into us picking up that cross because it was the reason for the cross. I think Jesus' his mission, his purpose for coming, his purpose for living, dying, raising was reconciliation. It was to reconcile us to the Father and to reconcile us to one another. So reconciliation, I don't think it's something that we must do, but it's a calling that we have to live out. It's who we are. So I think that we need to be able to understand that. We need to be able to speak that to our students, for them to be able to understand, because again, this generation, the Gen Z generation is coming even after mine. I don't want to say that they don't see, because and we may get into that later. It's not that they don't see color, because they do see it. They embrace it, you know, so they're living in a different context that even I, as a millennial, lived in. And I embrace culture a lot, but yet I found myself living in a context where that them and versus us mentality was there. It was strong. It was heavy. I'm grateful for amazing leaders in our denomination that covered me, that I was able to glean from, that started that process of trying to break that, but you still see some of that. And that's where I think we take up the cross. I think we need to be able to be intentional as leaders to step into some of these uncomfortable situations of getting out of our comfort zone, because it's not going to be easy. The conversations that we're having, they're not easy to have, but the reason that us four are able to sit here and freely have the conversation and put ourselves out there, I think is because we have relationship. This wasn't just you calling us Josh and saying, hey, and I said earlier, let me get a Hispanic, let me get a Black, let me get an Asian. No, we all have personal relationships. We've connected. Now, some are deeper than others, but we know each other's hearts. And I think that we've been intentional to connect with one another. And I think that is one of the greatest ways that as leaders, regardless of what culture you come from, for us to step out of our comfort zone of what we know and to try to build relationships with other leaders. I think we can't ask our students to step into something that we're not walking out and living. So I think the first thing is we need to look at our own circle. Do I have friends? Do I have other leaders that are different than me within my community? One of the big things that you said, and I've experienced with being able to work in the South for a little bit outside of the Hispanic context, the reality is there's going to be certain areas where culturally it is going to be just one culture, and that's what's there. And I don't think you can speak against that. But I think we need to, if our culture is diverse, if our city is diverse, if our area is diverse, then we need to be doing intentionality to connect with other people in that area. And if you're in an area that it's all white, it's all Black, it's all Hispanic, again, in this world of technology, we're able to build relationships so easy that I think even there, one of the practical things that we can begin to do is connect with other leaders, that we can try to find ways of how we can bring their voices into our youth group to speak. One of the things that during the season, as I'm talking with different leaders, and this is more at a pastoral level, and it always comes up of, man, I want to diversify my church. I want to be able to connect to other cultures. What do we do? And initially, my response was always, it starts at leadership. If you want to diversify your church, you need to bring somebody on staff, and that was usually my go-to. But the reality is, you're not just going to be able to do that tomorrow. You're not just going to be able to bring somebody in and do that. But one of the simple ways that I do think that we can connect is to bring voices that are different than those in our church, different than our way of always seeing things. And give them some pulpit time. Give them some time of connecting with them, because that's an in and out, but you're exposing your church, your students, to something that they've probably never seen before, heard before. And I think that will begin to get them to challenge probably some of the things that they're hearing at home and seeing at home, and beginning to reflect that with what they're seeing at church and what our commitment as believers to reconciliation should be. And it will begin to, I think, as leaders, force us into some of these difficult topics that we need to be having within our church and our context.
Can I just piggyback off of what Matt said? I think there's something that we also need to talk about in terms of students that kind of have a foot in two cultures, right? I think, Max, you can speak to this as well, but growing up for me, even me personally, being a second generation Korean here in America, there was the American side of the culture, and then there was the Korean side of the culture. And so it was really a struggle that I had to experience early on in my life, and to kind of try to see where I fit, because it didn't really fit in one or the other. It was just kind of, being straddled in the middle. And so I think there's a lot of students, especially in this day and age, especially as Max had pointed out, in this Gen Z culture, where people are more embracing of other cultures and people are from a lot of other cultures. They're trying to see where they land. And in the midst of all that, I think this conversation is really important to have, because these are some of the struggles that some of our students might be having with identity as well, not just racism, but with identity. And so in the immigrant church, I know this is a huge issue that we've had to deal with, especially with our student body. Talking about how to navigate racism, how to navigate being part of two cultures at the same time, how to navigate being a part of sometimes even 3 or 4 cultures at the same time, especially because we want to put ourselves out there and learn more about other cultures. And so how to be sensitive to that, how to approach that in a godful way. And I think that adds to the importance of why we need to have that conversation with our students as early as possible.
Yeah, and I like what you said, Max, and I wrote this down as you were talking, that if you want diversity in your group, then put diversity on your stage. And I think that is, we can say that we want diversity. I've talked to pastors who have said that they want diversity, and yet they don't have that on their staff, and they don't put that on their stage and during services, or even in online forums that we have now. You have to highlight that. That's important. That speaks louder than any sermon that you can preach about racism.
Can I even take it a little bit? Can I take it a little bit further?
Yes.
If you want diversity, true diversity, that's going to last, don't just invite them to your stage, but after that, invite them to your home.
Mm-hmm.
Invite them to your home.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it would be very easy, and especially in the context that we're living in, where we see everything's going on, and as a church, we want to respond. It could be very easy to say, hey, all right, let's bring it. It will be a part. We got a voice, and then go back to normal. But again, it's in this cancel culture that our students hear all the time outside. It's so easy to fall into that and cancel something that you don't have connection to. But when I have genuine relationship, I've had somebody that is different than me inside of my home, in my personal area, it builds a certain bond, and it allows us to be able to have even deeper conversations. Maybe you do invite them in again to speak, but that night a bond starts that now we can begin to ask questions, and I can say, hey Josh, when I say this, how does this sound, or how does it come off to you? And you can feel comfortable to do that, and we can connect in that personal manner. Again, it may start with initial invite, somebody you don't know at all, but you don't know how. When you have the right heart and you invite them again to your home, to your personal space, is what I'm trying to say with that. The impact that will begin to have in your life, and that then will begin to naturally reflect in your ministry, in your students, and everything else that flows from there.
That's good. It's a great point. Phil, you want to add anything to that about maybe some ideas, or how a student leader can take up this whole idea of not only being not being racist, but actually being anti-racist?
Yeah, one of the things that we have failed to do, not just as a body, but as a nation, I believe, is to truly educate our students when it comes to race. How I see it, we go through a whole process of, like, there's a layout from kindergarten until your senior year in high school for a student when it comes to their schooling. And in church, we have a first steps to becoming a leader in ministry when it comes to discipleship. And neither one of those things has a outline of how we have the conversation about race, how we have the conversation about different cultures and different people. And that is such a vital component, especially as believers. And there are a number of opportunities where we really get a chance to talk about it, but we don't take advantage of it. Like when we look at stories with Ruth and Esther, when we look at stories with Jesus, when we look at stories with Paul, all those and other people in the Bible, they're interacting with cultures that are not their own. They're interacting with different types of people, and they're having to deal with that. And it shows it right there in the text. We just don't take advantage of those stories to let it be a way for us to have the conversation about race and culture, because it's just going over our heads. And I'm a firm believer that if we're going to truly make a difference when it comes to these conversations, we're supposed to be doing it within the church. We're supposed to be doing it within ministry, because again, we are Christians first, and we're supposed to be looking at people as such, no matter what the circumstances may be. So, as a youth leader, I think one of the things that you have to do is to go back and look at the lessons that you might already have laid out for the year, and see where you can have the conversation about race and culture. I'm sure there are a number of points, even right now, with the information and study guides that you have, where you can have a chat about culture and maybe take 10 and 15 minutes to focus on that component of the scripture text that you are utilizing in conjunction to the full lesson that you're wanting to talk about. Another thing that you can do, which is vital, is what Max said, and actually start inviting folk to your house. We don't do that enough in church, visiting each other's homes, and that's one of the things that hurts us, because we focus too much on church as a building as opposed to the church as a body. It says it in the books of Acts, like they were going from house to house, left and right. Although they had buildings where they can go and congregate, there's a reason why it specifically states they were going to each other's houses. It's because that is really when you get the opportunity to get to know and understand someone deep down to their roots. Because it's really hard to hide who you are as a person when we're sitting around at your table and I'm looking at, or like Josh, we talked about it earlier, like it's really hard for me to not understand who you are as a person when you got Michael Jordan Funko Pops on top of your bookshelf, or you got, you know, your is that a Celtics hat I see over there in the corner? Like, it's really hard to hide those things when, if I'm sitting in your office. Same way, it's really hard to hide those things when I'm sitting at Brother Reyes' table and he starts to make me. I don't even know exactly where Max is from. I know he's from of Hispanic culture. I don't know, like Yucca or something like that. Or you know, yes, sir. Right? Like it's hard to not have the conversation when you're actually allowing yourself to delve into someone else's culture. So that's the second thing that we can do as youth leaders, is to actually go ahead and be like, hey, you know, Tommy, like I would love to go hang out with you and your family. Is it cool for me to, like, you know, go to your house? I'll bring a dish, you know, you guys bring a dish, or vice versa, and actually just hang out with one another. Because that was one of the benefits for me when I went to, for me, that I can clearly admit to throughout my entire life. Aside from living in Jersey City and being in a very diverse situation, I mean, to the point where for us, it wasn't even black or white. You couldn't say that, because people that looked white, like they might be French or Italian or Greek, or someone that's black, they could be Jamaican or Trini or Nigerian. So being in that space, we couldn't really just look at color to begin with, because it was so diverse. But then going to high school, where my parents shipped me off to a boarding school with other cats from legitimately coming from different countries, just little things that you experience, because their point of view is going to be different from yours. It's something that really can make a difference in your life. And I know, like Max said, like it's now, if you're from one place, it might be a little bit different in a region where there isn't that much diversity. It can be a little bit difficult, but even with that, you can kind of mix it up and say, hey, look, we might all be like our church is predominantly black. It's like, okay, we might all have like African American folk in our church, but let's all do something like go on ancestry.com or 23andMe and discover the different regions and cultures that we're really from, and then let's you know, whichever of us have the most from one country, we might get like someone in to come and talk about it. Or let's just try and like make a dish, or like a what do you call those, like a history project. Like, all right, well, you know, the end of this November for Thanksgiving for church, instead of us having like a traditional Thanksgiving meal, we're each gonna look at our ancestors' home heritage. Kids, like, you know, middle school kids, y'all write like a little school report and do like that three, I forget what them jokers are called. I'm sorry I ain't got kids. I hope y'all know what I'm talking about. Them little poster board joints. High school kids, y'all will get the opportunity to look at the music and the fashion, and then adults, y'all make one dish. And all just come together and just have the conversation and get to know just a little bit something. Now, of course, there will be some factor of ignorance there because you don't truly have someone present, but yeah, at least trying and making the attempt to grow and to develop. And then, of course, we have this beautiful thing called the internet, where you have Google and YouTube, where you could just, you know, research that information and have a 15, 30-minute video of someone that is either highly educated through college and studies, or just highly educated because that is their culture, that can help you out along the way. So if we look at those three things, which is actually one, outline when we can have the conversation about race and culture by looking at the racial and cultural issues that pop up in scripture. Two, go back to actually visiting people's homes and them visiting yours. And then three, making a celebration of culture that really shows that we really aren't that different from one another, because we are all, a lot of us do have a little bit of something from someplace else, and make a difference. I think doing any one or all those three things can be a great step for a youth leader to start bringing the conversation about race and culture, and really start bringing up diversity within your ministry.
And I think that to go along with that is just pure education, just educating yourself, doing the research, putting the time in to understand that there are things that you might say that might offend someone, and you need to educate yourself for that, you know. Just in this room right now, you know, Phil might not like to be called African American. You know, that might not define who he is. Brian is not Chinese, and Max is not Mexican, you know. And so, you know, but those are generalizations that people who look like me sometimes make, and people that don't look like me make.
And I was going to say, and to add to it, I think with the educational aspect of it, all of us, we also need to give the grace that we want to receive. Yeah. Because I think a lot of times what stops us from having this conversation is how the reaction of it. And regardless of where you come from, we can react in ways that quickly we get offended to, and thinking in that way. Even what you mentioned several times, I've had it said, not just, are you Mexican? Because again, that's the context of the Hispanics that they've been around, but what kind of Mexican are you? So it's almost, now what they're trying to say is, where are you from? What's your nationality? You're Hispanic, but where from? You know, I'm Dominican and Puerto Rican, but since their context has always been Mexican, or it's always been Puerto Rican, so that's kind of there. But again, I could easily get in my feelings, get upset. Oh, you're trying to be racist. No, they're just, it's ignorance in the right sense of the word. And now I need to be able to have the grace to use that as a moment, like you said. And those are times where, like you said earlier, in that moment, then I will use that right away in an educational way of saying, well, listen, I'm Dominican. My mom's from Puerto Rico. Dad's from Dominican Republic. You know, we're Hispanic. Mexican it's one country in there. So you use that manner, but there's grace that we need to give to all of us as we're learning from each other's cultures and stepping out of that comfort zone. When somebody does that, we need to have that grace.
And I love that. I thank you for saying that. And to add to that, just because someone gives you that grace does not give you the right to always bring up the fact that you're different. That's right. And, I made the mistake years ago. I thought it would be okay for me to describe myself to my friends, that I was just a cracker. In my mind, cracker meant that I was white like a cracker. There's a whole racial connotation when somebody calls you a cracker. And I had a friend pull me aside and said, that's not good. You don't address yourself that way, no matter how comfortable you are. I thought that I was relating when I was actually offending and putting myself at a level that I didn't deserve to be at, nor did I want to be at. And along with that, along with the education process, is I think it's important for us to be sensitive. There are moments, not by any fault of my own, and I'm just speaking from my own experience, where I have unintentionally put my friends in situations that may have made them feel uncomfortable. And Phil probably knows where I'm going with this, but it's been about a year ago. We were at his conference in New Jersey, and we were looking for a coffee shop. And we couldn't find a coffee shop anywhere after the conference. And the closest thing we had was a tea shop. And so me and Phil and my friend who is a Jamaican, he's a youth pastor here in the state, the three of us went into this tea shop. And I may have put them in a situation that they didn't want to be placed in, but I didn't even think about it, and we had a good time. We had a blast, but there were eyes on us. There were eyes on us. And that's one of the reasons that, Phil, you might not even know that I did this, but even several months later when we met, I won't say what town we were in, but we were at a conference together, and you and Brian met me, and I let you pick which restaurant that we were. And you still picked a restaurant that had nobody that looked like either one of you. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking around going, I feel terrible because, and that may or may not have bothered you, but for me, I thought, I don't ever want to put someone in a situation that's going to make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Josh, yeah. I think, and I had written this out as my mind was going with this and seeing it. I think it's important to understand intent versus impact. A lot of times we say something with a certain intent, but not understanding how it may be received, how it's going to impact somebody else. So I think that kind of just fit into what you were saying there, that we need to be kind of mindful that when we say something, it may not come out the right way, and it may not be received the right way. And again, have that grace, have that relationship and connectivity to be able to navigate how to flow through that in that sense. So
no, I think this kind of conversation is exactly what's needed between people. It's exactly what's needed between friends. It's exactly what's needed for young people to see and model. And I think, everybody here, they just hit the nail on the head. It's something that we have to show and model in our lives as leaders, right? And just like Max said, it starts from where the leaders are. And essentially what we're doing is we're teaching this next generation, how to have a voice, right? How to be an ally, how to be racially aware. And the best way to do that is through your example, right? They're going to take a look at you and your life, and it's your actions that are going to dictate more than your words, how they're going to react in these situations. And so I think every single one of you, I think what you guys have been talking about and what you guys have kind of shown in your sensitivities and the way that you respect one another and give respect first, that's something that I think the next generation can take and learn how to have a voice from that kind of experience. And so I think that's very, very important, is that I think a lot of our students these days, they're actually very, very reluctant to open their mouths in a lot of situations. They're very reluctant to say anything because anything could be construed in a negative way. And in an age where words can be so twisted, it's hard for them to know when to speak up, when to have that conversation. And by modeling it and by showing how we navigate that through relationship and through these kind of conversations, I think it'll give headway and it'll give license for our students to have that voice, to have those conversations in the appropriate light, in an appropriate manner. So thank you so much for.
I've loved our conversation and what you said there. They don't just need to hear it, they need to see it. And one of the things that I've loved about what we're doing here and what everybody I think at a certain point has done is you've shown transparency. And I think a lot of times what happened, what in the conversation that happened is that no one wants to be transparent and say, hey, I've messed up. I've said some things. I've done some things. I still say some things. I still do some things that I need to work through. And in that sense, so you've shared, your transparency, Josh, of, hey, this is where I've been. This is some of the stuff that I said. Brian, as you talked about your parents and in those aspects, our students, our church needs to see and hear that instead of saying, oh, no, I'm saved. If I'm a Christian, if you're a Christian, you can't be racist or you can't have that, because we hear that all the time. No, we still deal with biases, even as believers. Again, Jesus and the disciples, they dealt with it all through the beginning of the church, was fighting them to be one because of their differences. So I think that we need to be transparent and embrace it and be open with it. Allow them not to just hear us teach about it, but see us walk through this in our journey as well. And that opens them up, I believe, as also.
Yeah. I just want to say a quick disclaimer though about my parents, just in case, is that, they actually, it's not them, it's the society that they're a part of that kind of made them react that way. And they don't say it. They're not racist toward one group of people. In fact, they're very, very active with the Black community in Church of God in New Jersey, and and it's, I just don't want it to go back to them saying, just a disclaimer.
Well, the other thing about it, the other thing,
no, it's like, and it's like you said, it's a system thing. I remember again, when my parents, my mom in our house was very diverse, had friends from all over the place that came. But I remember my mom just sharing, because of her culture, coming from Puerto Rico. And if you go to Puerto Rico, you're going to find Puerto Ricans that are whiter than Josh's light skin, and they're darker than Phil. You're going to find all the array, all in between. But when my mom first came to the States from Puerto Rico, she remembered just saying, because her context wasn't around the Black community.
That's right.
She was afraid crossing the street because of her context of what she had seen in certain things. And her aunt, again, put her aside and said, listen, we all live together here. So you're going to be crossing the street all the time because, so again, like you said, it's my mom, I know she's not racist at all, but the context of the system that we're around does draw. So I definitely wasn't saying that, Brian.
Oh, no. I know. I just wanted to just put that out there for my parents' sake, because they're ministers in New Jersey.
Yeah. And that's something that I think we all need to understand as well. Like because there are prejudices even within the culture as well. Like so don't think, and I'm speaking specifically, I'm speaking to everyone, but I know it can kind of be it can kind of go too far the other way sometimes, where if you are not minority, you just think that everything that you're doing is wrong, like we're messing up and this and that and the third. But it's happening even within the culture as well. Like I am, like my dad coming from Grenada, which is in the Caribbean, so then, by the way, we were talking about the other ones, like you do not want to call someone Caribbean Jamaican. That ain't the truth. That's similar to like calling Mexican or Brian Chinese. My family from Grenada, like they kind of had a negative stigma in the beginning towards my mom because she was African American, or she is African American. So they had a negative stigma towards her, despite the fact that we are still under the Black umbrella. And that happens across other cultures and other peoples of color as well, and other minority groups. And that's a component that we have to discuss. And but it really shows that it really is about the system. And that's one thing that I hope everyone can take from all of this. It is, now there are sides of it, like there are magnitudes of it in which you will get there. For example, I'm not going to expect one of our teenagers to be able to successfully handle a true racial encounter because it's understood. But that is the goal, where even if someone does say some derogatory term towards you, you're still capable of forgiving them and being able to have the conversation with them despite all of that, because you're understanding that they're dealing with the same system that you're going through. Just because they were able to benefit from it does not mean that they're not also having to manage and go through it as well. That was one of the things that, I forget the name of the book, but as soon as I get it, I'll give it to you, Josh. But it talks about Nelson Mandela and apartheid in South Africa. And one of his quotes, and I'm just generalizing it here, he talks about how for him, one of the reasons why he was able to do what he did was because he didn't look at it about Black against white. He looked at it as we're all under the same system that has pitted us against one another. And that's the thing that we all have to acknowledge. It's not really about the issues that we are dealing with are not due to the individual, but it is us working with the individual that we can fix it.
Good. That's good. And I think that's a good place for us to stick a pin in this, because I think that we could continue this till dinner time. And it's so good and it's so healthy. And so for those of you that are watching, I want to encourage you to be intentional with your conversations with people. Look for opportunities to have this very discussion. And here's the deal. If you are in charge of a ministry, whether that's students or youth or children, whether that's if you're even watching this and you're in charge of the senior adults, you have a platform that you can teach and that you can show this whole idea of racial reconciliation. But I want to encourage you that you don't just address it on a Wednesday night where this is the day that we're going to talk about racism. Years ago, I had a job where I would write life plans and for people with disabilities, and so they could learn how to eat with a fork or brush their hair or learn to dress themselves, things like that. So I would write these programs for them. And in every one of the programs, we used a phrase, and it was called continuous active treatment. And you had to make sure that those that were the caretakers were they knew constantly how to take care and what their plan was for the people they were caring for, which meant that it wasn't just at dinner time that you taught them how to eat with a fork, but you would be intentional that daily you would teach them other ways to use that fork. I say all that to say this: it needs to become our vernacular. It needs to become the conversation. If you're teaching, just because you're not teaching on racism doesn't mean that you cannot throw that into a message when you're describing a relationship between two people in the Bible. and if you do that regularly, then it becomes part of their everyday vernacular, their everyday speech. And not just on the Wednesday night that you're saying, or the Sunday morning where you're like, today's the day we're going to talk about racism and prejudice. So look for those moments, look for those opportunities. Even if you're not on the stage, on a platform, behind a pulpit, look for those moments to teach your students always. And so I appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for being a part of this. I hope it's been helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.